Missed an episode of your favorite podcast? Choose from over a decade of content in our archives, not just the latest episode. All free at GCNlive.com.
This is your call to action. Get prepared, America. Economy, survival, energy, disasters. This is USAPrepares.com. Informative radio, educational radio. Interact now by emailing instructor@USAPrepares.com or text at 434-390-7953. Class, please take your seats. Now, your instructor, Vincent Finelli.
Well, welcome to the show, everybody. This is Rich Scheben sitting in for Vince Finelli today, and I want to thank Jason for engineering the broadcast in Minnesota. And I purposely asked Vince if I could interview Dr. Shealy because of the COVID questions, the COVID agenda, the COVID-1984, everything. And Dr. Shealy, I appreciate you being here. It really is an honor to interview you. It's an honor to hear your experience, your know-how, your knowledge, your integrity, your honor and patriotism to the American people. I know the audience really appreciates you dramatically for practicing what you preach, and I just wanted to mention that to you before I start drilling you with questions. So how are you today, sir?
I'm great. Thank you. Blessings. And Merry Christmas.
Yeah, Merry Christmas to you, too. Well, don't you know that's politically incorrect, Dr. Shealy? You must be a controversial, racist, bigot, sexist, misogynist, homophobe, intolerant volunteer.
All of the above and more.
That's right. Well, Dr. Shealy, again, it's such an honor to pick your brain because you don't just have a medical degree. You're not just a physician and a diagnostician, but you've been practicing this for years. Can you tell the audience how many years you've been a practicing physician, please?
64 and a half.
Wow. Folks, if you're not impressed, you're just better off hanging up the phone right now or you're shutting off your computer. That's longer than I've been alive, and wow, that's pretty doggone impressive. Dr. Shealy, I'm going to just start drilling you with questions, especially with this pandemic that we all know is out there. You know, the deadly pandemic that Bill Gates on video called for vaccination passports, which he publicly denied, even though it's on video, where he admits mRNA vaccines are experimental and will change your DNA forever, with a deadly pandemic that's got a recovery rate of 99.7%, and that is including comorbidities. Now, we know this virus was grown in the lab. We know there's a huge agenda behind it, and I've spent a lot of time on that. But let's make bathrooms okay for transgenders and identifying whatever sex you want. Now, there's a lot of evidence that the powers that be want to have resuscitation facilities at these vaccine centers because they are challenging their own safety and efficacy. There's evidence that reprograms your cells, compromises your immune system, and even proponents of this have called it a bioweapon when they thought the microphone was off. And we all know that there's a vaccine injury compensation program that's already paid out almost $5 billion off the books to vaccine injuries, which are basically secret courts. So I'm going to start with this question, Dr. Shealy, and I want you to verify if there's any validity in this. I read that the vaccine contains what's called MRC, Mary Richard Cat -5, which are basically aborted fetal cells. And most of these vaccines, if not all, from my research, do. And if we ask as a layperson, the diagnostician, is there a possibility of iatrogenic reactions, which most do, which are basically adverse reactions to multiple compounds, and the doctor or the diagnostician who wants to give you this vaccine, even though you want to opt out, you can still refuse because doctors have sworn a Hippocratic oath not to harm you, so you can legally decline the drug. Now, the Nuremberg Charter regarding informed consent on anything experimental, and the Hippocratic oath together, what, being a practicing physician, can you talk about the Hippocratic oath, the Nuremberg Charter, the MRC-5, and what rights do the people have if they feel that they actually feel that it's their body and their choice? Dr. Shealy.
Well, obviously, the correct answer is they can refuse on the grounds that they don't want it, period. End of report. On the other hand, the law being what it is these days, that may not work for everybody. I've often been saying since this all started to be talked about, I'd rather they shoot me with a bullet than with the vaccine. I personally do not trust it. Under no circumstance am I likely to trust it anywhere within the next 5 years. In fact, it has not been tested long enough, in my opinion, to even be on the market, let alone be used in general ways. So the Hippocratic Oath says the number one responsibility of a physician is to do no harm. Well, you know, the interesting thing about that is, in the hospital, 21% of all people hospitalized have some kind of adverse reaction, not related to the disease. Something goes wrong. That's a pretty high percentage of bad news just from being in the hospital. In July 2000, the JAMA reported the number 3 cause of death in this country is the medical system. It's listed after cancer and stroke and heart attack, and is a complication of drugs at the top of the list and surgery and infections and other complications. Not talked about very often. Interesting, a book came out within a year or so of that called Death by Medicine by Gary Null and a few other people, and they claim that the actual death rate of the medical system is 3 times what was reported in the July 2000 JAMA article, that people are dying of complications of the treatment, but they're being signed out as dying from the disease. The same has been true since the beginning of this, what I call fake-edemic, pseudodemic, fraudedemic, etc. I do not believe that this virus is any worse than the average flu. That's at the top of my list. Number 2, even the CDC 1 week admitted that less than 10% of the deaths that were being reported were really from the virus, but were from the primary disease. And that's true in every epidemic, in every flu year. People with any other disease, from diabetes to hypertension, heart disease, whatever, Alzheimer's, all die with any additional stress, can die. So I don't trust a single statistic that has come out, because every single one that's been reported has been contradicted by someone sooner or later. I'll get off my box.
Dr. Shealy, trust me, I'm speaking for the whole audience here. I love for you to get on your box, because you're speaking from experience, you're speaking from knowledge, you're speaking from qualifications, and we really appreciate it. And Dr. Shealy, if you could just verify to the audience that I'm not throwing purposeful softball questions at you, that we didn't talk the night before, that we didn't exchange emails, that I am literally giving you what I consider to be valid questions, expecting valid answers, correct?
Oh, yes, I didn't know until I called in this morning that Vince wasn't going to be here, so...
Well, I kind of threatened him a little bit. You know, I told him if he didn't let me interview you today with all these COVID-19 84 questions, that I was going to start singing 1970s disco songs, and he just gave in right there. So, I did threaten him, but, we got it pulled off. So, Dr. Shealy, with what you just said, could I sum it up in a very short statement saying that in every way, the cure is worse than the problem when you look at side effects, lockdowns, contraindications, adverse events, poverty, unitive measures of despair. I mean, my gosh, I'm not a fan, and anybody who does any reading and research is not a fan of the CDC or the FDA. In fact, we even made jokes when we used to work for Big Pharma that they don't care about the cure. They care about managing symptoms for profit. And everybody who worked for Big Pharma back in the day knew that the AMA, the FDA, and the CDC was owned, and I use that word in quotes, by Big Pharma. And CDC even admits that we in just 2020 alone, we've had 81,000 deaths from drug overdoses. Never mind, the suicides, all the units of measure of despair. I mean, in San Francisco alone, overdose deaths have far outpaced so-called COVID. Your comments, Dr. Shealy.
Absolutely true. No question about it. We finished an experiment this year. We started it in the previous year, and in the first 6 months, we were able to regenerate the telomeres by 8%. That is absolutely the most striking thing we've ever been able to do. Telomeres shrink 1% every year of life under healthy situations. And I've been able to regenerate them 3.5% with a number of techniques, but 8%. So then we happened to start another project for 6 months right at the beginning of the stupidemic. And the average person lost 1 or 2% instead of gaining anything. In other words, they lost twice the annual rate in 6 months, and it's all because of the stupidemic. People are frightened beyond belief, and for good reason, and of course, being put out of work, financially and otherwise, and the restrictions that put on people are panicked. It is not an epidemic, it's a pandemic.
Mm-hmm. And when you have, again, any unit of measure of despair, which panic is in there, it reduces people's immune system, correct?
Absolutely. The anxiety is really the number one cause of all illness. It is a minor to major component of everything. It leads to depression. It leads to pain. It leads to heart disease. It leads to diabetes. It leads to everything.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure you heard or read about, and maybe you didn't because you're so busy with your practice and your radio shows. You have your own radio show as well. And Dr. Shealy, remind people of your radio show and your website, if you don't mind, real quickly.
KICK 1340 AM, Wednesdays at 4 p.m. Central Time.
Awesome. Well, everybody, we'll be back with Dr. Norm Shealy after the break. We really appreciate you being here, and you'll get some good information today. Welcome back to the broadcast, everybody. We appreciate you being here in America and those of you listening around the world. And this is Rich Scheben sitting in for Vincent Finelli today, and I am interviewing Dr. Norm Shealy. Dr. Shealy, before the last break, you used the word trust. Now we talked about the MRC-5, which is aborted fetal cells in these vaccines. Even the Vatican, which is hardly considered moral and ethical these days, even said it was unethical. I just read that story this morning. We have all these vaccine injury compensation programs that are hidden. We have preservative adjuvant stabilizers in these vaccines. We have inactivating ingredients like formaldehyde. We have antibiotics like neomycin. when I worked for Big Pharma, everybody was very concerned about creating a bacterial Frankenstein, because back in the 80s and the 90s, when I started working, you went in for a runny nose, and the physician would write you a script for some type of antibiotic. Sometimes, a second-generation cephalosporin, sometimes a Cipro that basically destroys the normal flora in your body. I've correlated processed foods with processed synthetic drugs several times over the years, and I'm just wondering what your opinion is of what I just mentioned, especially regarding trust, because we're living in an era now where treason, sedition, and espionage and racketeering, especially by today's judges, lawyers, and courts, and of course I'm making an analogy to election fraud, is now like going to a store and buying a product. When we live in an era where it's 100% probability that President Trump won in a landslide, we're supposed to believe that a vaccine that's 90+% effective with virus mutations going on, where 99.7% recovery rate by the proponents of the vaccine, publicly, who are calling, like Bill Gates, calling for depopulation, and we see a political ideology for sale regarding science, math, medicine, politics, the whole works, when today's job description should be for everything in these institutions the first question should be on your interview, are you willing to use your job title to sell the narrative, to sell out the people for money? And I was wondering if you could comment on what I just said, Dr. Shealy.
Well, I don't call it the pharmacomafia instead of Big Pharma for nothing. I have called it the pharmacomafia for over 20 years. I think they are part of the evil empire.
Now, regarding some of these like preservative adjuvant stabilizers, some of these things that create the processed synthetic drug in the vaccine, like monosodium glutamate, sucrose, human serum albumin, alcohol, yellow dye number 6, aluminum lake dye, aluminum hydroxide, sodium chloride, formaldehyde, glycerin, potassium phosphate, ammonium citrate, lactose, polysorbate 80, yeast proteins, bovine serum albumin. And then they have the audacity, Dr. Shealy, to create legislation where they demand no liability immunity. And in fact, I have an article in front of me here that says you can't use Pfizer or Moderna if you have a severe vaccine side effects. The government won't compensate you. And they make it very clear that you can't even sue these people. So they're asking for liability immunity with very questionable efficacy and safety rates, where they have hidden vaccine compensation programs, but yet I have an article here that says man just sued his parents, 42 years old, living in the basement because they destroyed his porn collection. After this break, Dr. Shealy, I want to hear your comment. I'm not making this up, I promise. Published articles in the public domain, Dr. Shealy. We'll be right back, everybody. Welcome back to the broadcast, everybody. Rich Scheben sitting in for Vincent Finelli, broadcasting from the Northern Rockies in Montana, and I'm with Dr. Norm Shealy. Dr. Shealy, before the break, I mentioned some of the fillers, if you will, the preservatives, the stabilizers that we talked about, MRC5, which is aborted fetal tissues in the vaccines. We talked about, I mentioned polysorbate 80, human serum albumin. What is your opinion of these so-called processed synthetic fillers that I am calling in these vaccines regarding safety and efficacy, especially when they have a vaccine injury compensation program that they've already paid out billions of dollars in behind closed doors? Dr. Shealy.
Poison Is that an adequate answer? I don't like it. They're all dangerous. But I want to point out that among the most ignored is aluminum. There is not one known good use of aluminum in the human body. And it's been in many of the vaccines for decades. And the cans, by the way, so-called cans, the cans in general are not lined with plastic at all. I have personally tested beer, Coca-Cola, and a whole bunch of other canned goods, and they are pure aluminum inside.
Yeah, very good point. I mean, even the CDC, a lot of so-called distinguished, credible, I'm using that in very heavy air quotes right now, institutions even admit that mercury, MSG, formaldehyde, aluminum, a lot of potent neurotoxic chemicals or heavy metals are in these so-called vaccines, these so-called flu vaccines, which is a huge immune suppressant as we know it. Now, especially with these nanotechnologies and heavy metals, you getting close to 5G electromagnetic radiation, you're like a human walking antenna, which is quite disturbing. Do you have any information on that or a comment, Dr. Shealy?
Well, all I know is, in my opinion, aluminum is poison. It can cause Alzheimer's disease and every other known neurologic. It can damage your immune system. It can kill you. And canned vegetables, by the way, most canned vegetables are really aluminum. I wouldn't buy anything in a can.
Very good point. Very good point. I always tell people when they want to stock up on food, buy bulk. You could do that with pasta. You can do that with beans. You could do that with rice that never touched the inside of a can. And with very few dollars, you can easily have a year's worth of food just with those three items because they are pretty inexpensive and they will keep you alive. Now, Dr. Shealy, regarding some of these therapeutics, we all know that HCQ or hydroxychloroquine has been, the powers that be don't want the people to know about it, especially when you include vitamin D and zinc and maybe a Z-Pack with that. And there was a doctor by the name of Dr. Corey who was in a Senate hearing recently and was a very credible physician who talked about ivermectin. He says, you take it, you won't get sick. He says it's good as a prophylactic drug as well. He says it's proven in many trials and studies. It's antiviral, it's anti-inflammatory. So regarding HCQ and ivermectin, do you have any experience in those drugs, and what's your opinion on that, Dr. Shealy?
I have no experience whatsoever, and personally I don't trust it. But if you take adequate D3 and adequate vitamin C and adequate B complex, that is the best prophylactic in the world. And if you feel as if the flu is coming on of any kind or a cold, then you can triple dose the vitamin D3 for 3 days. I haven't had a viral infection in 15 years or more because I always take 50,000 units of vitamin D3 once a week. And if I felt something coming on, maybe once a year, maybe I'll take 150,000 3 days in a row. It always knocks it out.
Can you please repeat for our listeners, Dr. Shealy, what you think is the best prophylactic treatment? And before you mention that again, there's a lot of question about efficacy and safety from just going to a Costco and buying Chinese so-called nutritional supplements or wherever they come from being not as efficacious or safe as they once were. Could you comment on that, and please repeat your prophylactic treatment for the people one more time, please?
Well, yes, at the top of my list, of course, if it comes from China, I don't trust it. The only good thing Chinese have ever created is acupuncture and fireworks. Now, beyond that, I personally, if you weigh 140 pounds or more, you should take 50,000 units of D3 once a week. If you weigh under 140 pounds, take it 3 times a month, so the 1st, the 10th, and the 20th of every month. Now, with that, ideally you take 2 grams of vitamin C a day, but when you take extra vitamin C, you also need extra B complex, and that means at least 25 milligrams of B1, B2, B3, B6, etc. That is the basic for the immune system, in my opinion.
Now, can you overdose on vitamin D3 or even a vitamin C or a B complex? Can you take too much, Dr. Shealy?
Okay. If you take too much vitamin D3, it can cause problems with calcium and kidney. So if you, but I've been doing this, as I said, I'm sure that I've taken probably, in addition to 12 times a year, I'm 52 times a year taking 50,000. I've taken at least once or twice 150,000 several days in a row and never had a problem. Now, I did a study many years ago where we gave people 50,000 a day, and as long as you check the vitamin calcium level in your blood and stop if it gets too high, you'll be okay. The big problem is it can't increase calcium. Now, when you take this much D3, you do not need to add calcium in your diet. And of course, one of the worst combinations is the mixture of calcium and magnesium, because it interferes with the absorption of magnesium. You can't absorb magnesium out of the gut if it has calcium in the gut at the same time.
I'm looking at my vitamin D3 right now, my bottle, if you will, and it's a dosage of each tablet is 1,000 IU. I'm so used to talking milligrams and micrograms from my pharmaceutical era, but I probably take vitamins maybe once or twice a week. I don't take them every day. Now, I realize that, even though I'm 60 years old, and by the way, I identify as a 29-year-old, just so you know, even though I'm 60 years old, Dr. Shealy, I realize that when you get older, absorption and metabolism is another issue. So should people, regarding vitamins, incorporate that into their dosage regimen and take more or take it with food? I was always told that when you take your vitamins or medication with food, you're going to get better absorption. Your comment, please.
In general, that's true. Now, I actually take huge numbers of supplements. I often say I have been on vitamin supplementation since I was conceived. My mother was a natural gardener, type person, and I've never not been on B complex and vitamin C in my entire life. I think, in general, you can take 1,000 milligrams a day as long as you get at least 10 to 20 milligrams of vitamin B complex. But when you take the larger doses of C, you must take a little bit of increase, especially for B6. But I prefer B complex. It's better to get it all, in my opinion. And it's safe. Now, I turned 88 2 weeks ago, and I still feel 26. And I've been on all this stuff, 88 plus years.
Well, Dr. Shealy, first of all, happy birthday. And second of all, how can you be almost 30 years older than me and identify as a 26-year-old when I identify as a 29-year-old? I'm sorry, that's unacceptable.
Sorry about that. I look upon 26 as a peak year of my life. That's the year I got married, and it was, certainly a peak year of my life, and I still feel that energetic, physically, mentally, emotionally.
Well, you certainly act it, that's for sure. The fact that you're still practicing, you're doing radio shows, you have a website. I mean, holy smokes, that's pretty doggone impressive for any age, Dr. Shealy. I want to mention a couple articles here. Communist China successfully infiltrated vaccine giants Pfizer, AstraZeneca, and GlaxoSmithKline as part of basically part of an unrestricted infiltration process. And I have another article here that Merck plant, where COVID-19 vaccines will be manufactured, is a biohazard nightmare production. On the floor, there's blood, there's feces. I saw a picture of it. Now, before one of the breaks already, I also mentioned, and the music came up, the commercial came up. We didn't have a chance for you to comment. There's an article here which I've talked about liability immunity, which these pharmaceutical companies are asking for, like Pfizer and Moderna said if you have severe vaccine side effects, the government won't compensate you for any damages as well. And then I finished it up, and I heard you laughing, where there's an article, these are all published articles in the public domain, where a man sued his parents, who's 42 years old, living in his parents' basement, and his parents threw away his porn collection. But the guy, the 42-year-old man living in his parents' basement, was successfully able to sue his parents for this so-called valued porn collection, but yet we can't even sue Big Pharma, who gets tons of grant money and money from the American people, taxpayers, for destroying our body and our immune system. Can you please comment on that?
I hope that somehow goes to the Supreme Court, although I question the Supreme Court these days, too.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's pretty scary, especially when you have this Tennessee nurse fainting on camera. And, boy, the excuses that came out from the powers that be, Dr. Shealy, it was unbelievable. In fact, even a French professor was thrown in the psych ward for questioning COVID-19 vaccines, who has a lot of credibility in that arena. See, we're getting to the point, like, that little trust thing that you and I talked about earlier. It's getting to the point where when treason, sedition, espionage, and racketeering is a product the elite can buy in the store, how do we trust these people?
I don't.
We'll be right back, everybody. Welcome back to the broadcast, everybody. Rich Scheben sitting in for Vincent Finelli, and I am talking to Dr. Norm Shealy. And Dr. Shealy, I'm looking at an article here. It's titled Peak COVID Stupidity. And and they're talking about the sources of spreading COVID in New York, and we all know New York and California has sold out to the communist agenda. And all these small businesses, especially restaurants, they're even their own data. This is their own data. They're saying that just a little over 1% of these sources that have spread in New York are from restaurants. And yet, all these poor people are being told they can't work. They're being displaced. Their small business is not essential. But yet, the virus knows to attack people, Dr. Shealy, in small businesses, even though their own data says it doesn't. But the big corporations can stay open. Do you have a comment on that, Dr. Shealy?
Well, the important thing to me is they haven't even been certain unequivocally that they can actually identify this virus. That alone makes you wonder, how could you have developed a vaccine if you don't know what the virus is? And
and even the so-called PCR test, and I think I have an article coming up where the WHO admits it's not effective, it's not valid. Basically, I have personally given many an article regarding how these PCR tests are 93 to 97% ineffective. That means there's no validity. Here's another article right here, and I basically glean the talking points out of a lot of these articles, Dr. Shealy. And New York Governor Cuomo, he was screaming for us not to gather in groups, make sure we're wearing masks, make sure we're 6 feet apart, make sure restaurants are closed, make sure small businesses are closed, make sure families break apart and they starve and they keep their kids out of school. But, Dr. Shealy, you know, I have to throw a little satire in here, and unfortunately, again, my disclaimer is these are published articles in the public domain, but Governor Cuomo has deemed Saturday Night Live as essential, and they're allowed to have a live audience, but everybody else has to wear masks, be 6 feet apart, have to have your restaurants and businesses closed, has to get rid of the word family, have to keep your kids out of school. But Saturday Night Live is essential. Your comment, Dr. Shealy.
I totally agree with everything except Cuomo. I question him above any other governor in the world. He's beyond an idiot. Mm-hmm. He's dangerous to your health.
Absolutely. I totally agree. In fact, Rand Paul recently came out, Republican senator from Kentucky, basically saying that, and he's a physician, as you know, it's Dr. Rand Paul. He's a practicing physician, and he does a lot of work for the little people and volunteers a lot of his services. And he talks about the public health purposes of the mask being, quote, all about submission, which I've mentioned this in the breaking of people's will many times. Your comment on that, Dr. Shealy. Do you believe that Dr. Rand Paul is right regarding...
Absolutely. I agree with him totally. Fauci, in my opinion, is part of the evil empire. I wouldn't trust him to tell me the time of day.
You know, a lot of these so-called COVID patients and hospitalizations that they say is coming, where I have so much data that shows ICU and hospitals are actually on the decrease. And they're saying that over half of the growth is coming from 2 states, which are the 2 most communist governors, California and New York. And it's pretty obvious that when you connect the dots, Dr. Shealy, that there's a lot of hypocrisy, double standards, and and false information for the purpose of the agenda. And that's very disturbing, if you ask me. Now, yeah, I want to mention some more articles, Dr. Shealy, and I want your comments. Dr. Birx, you know, I talk about double standards and hypocrisies all the time. Dr. Birx, which is basically Dr. Fauci's right-hand woman, she was telling everybody how you have to lock down, don't visit family, and she was just caught, a family member, and I want your comment after the break, she was just caught going to her family on Thanksgiving weekend and being around children and grandkids and all this stuff. It's really disgusting that they tell us what to do, but they don't practice what they preach. Your comment after the break. We'll be right back after the top of the hour break with Dr. Norm Shealy. Welcome back to USAPrepares.com. Rich Scheben from Montana sitting in for Vincent Finelli. And we are talking to Dr. Norm Shealy. Right before the break, Dr. Shealy, I talked about an article, and I've mentioned so many articles from Governor Newsom, Nancy Pelosi, the mayor of Denver. I have lost count of the hypocrisies and double standards. And here we have Dr. Deborah Birx, who's a coordinator of the White House coronavirus response, warning Americans, quote, be vigilant, limit celebrations to your immediate household. And basically somebody turned her in from her own family because they couldn't stand her hypocrisy when she traveled on her Thanksgiving vacation to be around 3 generations of her own family from multiple households, including son-in-law, 2 young grandchildren. Oh my God! You know what? My specific question to you, Dr. Shealy, is: with all these hypocrisies and double standards, is there anybody stupid enough in America who believe that these so-called hypocritic double standard leaders are really afraid of the quote-unquote deadly pandemic? Dr. Shealy.
Well, when you're stupid and evil, nothing works. And several of the things that bother me most about Trump is having Fauci and anybody on his staff working for you on anything. I don't know how that happened. I don't think Trump is somehow responsible for this crap, but he endorsed it by having Fauci and this woman who is a total crook. She needs to be burned in public square, in my opinion. Maybe just whipped to death.
Yeah, I think millions of Americans would probably agree with you, Dr. Shealy, and this goes back to the trust issue that we both have mentioned on this show already today. It's hard to believe what to trust when you have so much information and so much hypocrisies and double standards. I mean, I can't even count. Even Dr. Fauci, we've seen him without a mask. We've seen a lot of these people going to restaurants, going to parties. I mean, I remember reading an article recently where the health department in, I think it was Pennsylvania, was suggesting that if you attend an orgy, it's too risky not to wear a mask. I'm sorry,
you can't fix stupidity.
Oh, it's gotten to the point where nothing matters. It's gotten to the point where literally lies, hoaxes, treason, sedition, espionage, racketeering is a product in a store for these so-called institutional leaders, lawyers, judges, and courts. It's unbelievable. Okay, next article, Dr. Shealy. I'd like to get your comment. 4 volunteers immunized with Pfizer's coronavirus developed Bell's palsy, and the FDA is denying that the vaccine caused it. Again, evil and stupidity is a bad mix. Your comments on that, Dr. Shealy?
Well, Bell's palsy is extremely rare, and if it came on within a few days even of the vaccine, I would definitely blame the vaccine, period. But they're lucky if that's all they got.
Yeah, these neurological disorders, from autism to you name it. I'm noticing LDS diseases increasing. A lot of neurological symptoms and diseases are on the increase from my reading. And what do you attribute to? It's got to be vaccines. It's got to be poor nutrition in our foods, lack of vitamins. The unit of measure of despair, like anxiety that we've talked about earlier in the show, they're all contributors to what's happening. And ironically, and the people who are proponents of all these therapies are also proponents of world depopulation, which is pretty doggone scary. Next article, Dr. Shealy. Flu vaccines raises risk of COVID death, correlation confirmed by scientific analysis. When you have studies like this coming forth, published studies in the public domain, how can the powers that be go forth with these vaccines? And I believe President Trump, I think he's getting a lot of bad information, bad advice from people on the inside who are bought and paid for at every level. And we've talked about that on other shows, and I think that's what's happening. But when you have this information and you have it dovetailed with Grand County, Colorado, where 40% of COVID deaths were confirmed to be victims of gunshot wounds, how can you look the public in the eye when you have people like Dr. Birx literally going against their own advice? How should the people take this, Dr. Shealy?
They should have a public arsenal and go and whip her to death in public square, in my opinion. That's just my opinion. I'm not a violent person, but people like that need to be destroyed.
Yeah, I mean, when you have studies coming up, real studies that show the flu vaccine raises COVID death and correlation confirmed by scientific analysis, and the good people who come forth, they lose their license, they get demonetized, they even go to prison or psych wards. I mean, it's pretty obvious that just like censorship in general, it's gotten to the point where it's literally, let me put it this way, if if information is censored, and you could tell me if you agree or not, it usually indicates, if not always, a threat to the corrupt people who are selling these narratives, those who have addictions to power, money, and control, they're invested in hiding the truth, because truth does not require censorship. But misinformation, propaganda, hoaxes, false flags, lies, gaslighting, that all depends on censorship. And threats, bribe, surveillance, and blackmailing, you could throw that in there as well. So when you are hiding the truth and creating misinformation for your agenda, it's pretty obvious what's going on. It's almost a direct admission to guilt in my book. Dr. Shealy?
Agree. All the way.
Okay. Next article. Americans' mental health hits 20-year low ahead of renewed lockdowns. Now, I realize a lot of these polls, Dr. Shealy, a lot of these focus groups, they have an outcome that they want to achieve by doing this. But in this case, when they say a 20-year low, it's probably a 50-year low. And I'm wondering, when you have these units of measure of despairs, like increased obesity, increased overdose of drugs, increased suicides, all the bad stuff is increasing. How do people justify? When you have a patient, let's say I was your patient, I was walking in your door, and I gave you some of these statistics. How could I justify, let's say you were a proponent of these vaccines, how could I justify with just the evidence we've discussed today, never mind since March, how could you justify, as a physician, that these vaccines are safe and effective, Dr. Shealy?
Well, you can't. It's a lie. That's being kind to call it a lie.
So when you have, when I was a pharmaceutical rep back in the day, a lot of physicians would talk to each other, would have discussions, peer-to-peer discussions about disease states or about the efficacy or the safety of a particular drug. When physicians talk to each other today, and they're seeing medical tyranny in front of their eyes, are physicians actually talking to each other? Are they afraid of being put in the column or in the category of not conforming, and there's less communication between physicians today?
Well, if they work at a hospital, they know they already are controlled. I wrote a book about 20 years ago called Third Party Rape. And third party is not just the insurance mafia, it includes the hospitals.
But, I don't know of very many independent physicians left that don't have hospital privileges, Dr. Shealy.
I'm one of the few.
You are.
I dropped out of... I was actually invited to look at the chairmanship of the Department of Neurosurgery when I was on the faculty at Western Reserve. I was so tired of the bureaucracy of the university, I left and never went back. And now I won't even work under a hospital, let alone a medical school or any other bureaucracy. All bureaucracy is evil, in my opinion.
I agree. Dr. Shealy, next article right here. UK regulator warns public to avoid COVID-19 shots if they already struggle with allergies. Well, before your comment, I look at just the overall American's immune system has decreased so much over the years because of lack of nutrition, lack of information, maybe a lazy, less physical lifestyle. We can go on forever. So when you hear UK regulator warns public to avoid COVID-19 shots if they already struggle with allergies, that's probably like 90% of the people, Dr. Shealy.
Actually, it's a little bit more than that. It's 97.3% of the people who are lacking 1 to 5 essential health habits.
Wow. Well, now we go back to the Hippocratic Oath and the Nuremberg Charters that I mentioned earlier in the show. regarding informed consent and just this UK regulator. If 97% of people, conservatively speaking, struggle with allergies, how can the powers that be justify these jabs into the people?
Well, the powers that be can't justify anything they do to speak of.
Yeah. You know how different television shows have different news, pardon me, I said it wrong, different propaganda outlets like MSNBC, CNN, ABC, they have their own physicians that work for them. And one's name is Dr. Gupta. And I don't know if this is a quote, but at least it's a paraphrase. He says that getting vaccinated does not, did I say that correctly? Does not stop infections or the spread of COVID-19. So when you hear a comment like this, does not stop infections or the spread of COVID-19, what is the point?
Duplicity.
What is the point?
The kindest thing you can say is duplicity.
I mean, shouldn't that be enough evidence right there for the people to say no? Never mind the MRC-5. We'll be right back with Dr. Shealy, folks. Welcome back, everybody. I'm speaking to Dr. Norm Shealy. This is Rich Scheben broadcasting from Montana. And Dr. Shealy, I'm going to mention a few more articles here, and I want your comments, please. Author of U.S. bioweapons law warns DARPA is illegally experimenting on U.S. citizens, and a shoulder-type article by Dr. Francis Boyle says DARPA's biowarfare weapon vaccine will kill people. Your comments, please.
I agree. I can't tell you what percentage you're going to die as a result of it, but it'll be greater than any vaccine in history, probably.
If I went to, let's say you owned a restaurant, or any type of business, and I went there, or anybody went there, Tom, Dick, and Harry, Jane, Sue, doesn't matter, and they got sick from your food, and there was either mortality or such a serious morbidity that it affected your life for the rest of your life, the lawsuit would be astronomical. How can these big pharma people have the audacity to demand liability immunity, Dr. Shealy?
Well, it's not audacity. It's just pure evil mafioso behavior. They're crooks. Crooks have the audacity to do anything. They kill with no conscience.
Wow, that's pretty scary. That's pretty sad. You know, even the World Health Organization, which is all part of the bought and paid for cabal, as we know, mostly owned by and operated by China, finally admits, because there's credibility issues with all these lies that they've been given, they finally admit that these PCR tests have created false positives. And there's so much evidence, like we mentioned earlier in the show, 93 to 97% false positives. You know, it's amazing how people's lives, businesses, health, immune system is being ruined by these so-called PCR tests that have zero credibility, or at least between 3 and 6% credibility. Is there, from a Hippocratic Oath perspective, Dr. Shealy, when you see the testing given false positives up in the 90%, do we have some type of, do the people have some type of legal recourse, you know, especially regarding the MRC-5, which is aborted fetal tissues in these vaccines? What do you, I mean, you're obviously an honorable, ethical, moral, experienced physician, and you practice what you preach. But when somebody comes to you from a different diagnostician, and they said, well, we're going to start forcing these vaccines on you, what what advice do you give or can you give to these patients, Dr. Shealy?
Well, I can give them an exemption as I do for the mask, but it may not be honored. And as you've already indicated, the mafioso have already exempted themselves from being sued. So I'm not sure there is an outlet. If you can't sue the bastards, you don't have any outlet.
Well, I think mafiosa is an understatement because I'm looking at an article here by Andrew Yang calls for barcode to prove barcode attached to people, like either a tattoo or something, or some type of electronic technology to prove that you've taken the coronavirus vaccination. Dr. Shealy.
That's part of the evil empire's plan for a long time. I mean, it's like Auschwitz. It's the tattoo of the evil empire.
Right. Yeah. This is Nazi, Stalin, Hitler, Mao, Pol Pot type stuff that we're seeing in modern day technology. And the NYPD are now deploying robot dogs to catch COVID violators. This is beyond 1984. Your comment, Dr. Shealy.
Oh, boy, more. You know, everything you talk about is evil. What else can I say? That's an insult to the dog industry.
Yeah. We'll go right back, everybody. Welcome back to the show, everybody. Rich Scheben sitting in for Vincent Finelli, and we're talking with Dr. Norm Shealy. And Dr. Shealy, the next article I wanted to throw your way is titled World Economic Forum Wants Big Government, Big Banks, and Big Corporations to Vaccinate the World. And, of course, the head of the World Economic Forum is Klaus Schwab, and he mentioned that we should all be eating weeds, bugs, and drinking sewage water. Now, you as a practicing physician, have you ever seen, is dysentery, let's say people did drink poor water or eating weeds. I mean, I harvest edible medicinal plants, but I've spent years researching them. Now, if you just want people to go out in their backyard, I mean, what about toxicity issues? Do you ever see any of these things?
Well, not of that degree. But that man should have his head forced down the toilet and flushed repeatedly till he's gone. You know, people like that need to be gotten rid of rather than listened to. I'm not a violent person.
It's amazing how much power these people wield. You know, if you are willing to sell the American people out for money, power, and all those other type of addictions, control, that's what we get. Because we've sat back for so many decades and we're reaping the consequences of basically the inaction towards political correctness, which political correctness, the antonym, is really truth. And this is why, you know, we're seeing mental health hitting 20-year lows because of renewed lockdowns and all the other issues surrounding the agenda. Dr. Shealy, I read an article, I think I've mentioned this on the air once or twice over the last few weeks, where masks, now dentists are coming out and saying that they're seeing a 50% increase in gum disease, which I want you to verify that mouth bacteria is probably the worst bacteria in the human body, which is also associated with heart attacks. Can you confirm some of that? What's your opinion on that?
That is true. No question about it. Now, again, among other things, I use an ozone-containing toothpaste. I haven't used fluoride in my toothpaste in 50 years or more, but I do like ozone to keep my mouth cleaner. In fact, I haven't been to the dentist now in the longest period since I can remember in childhood. I was supposed to have an appointment in March. They were closed. They opened back up in September and said I'd have to come in wearing a mask. And I said, well, call me back when I don't need to wear a mask. So I've now been 15 months without a tooth cleaning. But using my ozone toothpaste, it really has kept my teeth in as good shape as when I get them cleaned every 6 months.
Okay, well, that's great advice. You mentioned fluoride. I think our listeners know that fluoride, even China labels it as a pesticide, and it's often a main ingredient in rat poison. And there's zero research of any benefits in fluoride. And
in fact, I consider it the number one toxicity in the world. In every city that has fluoride, and the average sperm count has gone down from 150 million to 40 million. When it gets to 20 million, men are infertile. If we don't get rid of fluoride in the city water within the next 20 years, there'll be no more babies. That's how bad it is.
Well, that's what one of their goals is, sterility, not just in males but in females, and it also makes people docile, which is fluoride's. That's one of their main claim to fame. In fact, I have an article in front of me here regarding contaminants in tap water may be linked to more than 100,000 cases in America. Now, think about that, and here we're talking about COVID mortality. There's so many other categories, like you mentioned, medical malpractice and hospitals are number 3 on the list. And even farm groundwater has toxic chemicals. If you buy old pasture land that was owned by some farmer who used glyphosate or any of these, chemicals, which they all do today, it's not just toxicity in municipal water, but in city water. It's also, it could be rural water as well regarding the wells. Your comment, Dr. Shealy.
It's something even worse than that now. 75% of all the rain average in this country has Roundup in it. There is no such thing as organic. In fact, I consider it a lie to call something organic if it was raised outside and not in a totally purified environment. And that means our groundwater, because it all comes out of the rain ultimately, our groundwater is now beginning to have Roundup in it. Poison. The number one poison in the world, even worse than fluoride.
I'll tell you something, Dr. Shealy, it's getting almost impossible to believe any person or institution at a high level because they're all bought and paid for. It's just like it's analogous to the COVID mortality. Yep. Now they have a category, pneumonia, influenza, and COVID is in the same category. And it's a lot more. It's heart attacks, it's strokes, it's cancer, it's gunshot wounds. My gosh. I mean, how do people... I mean, if you go to a hospital today when all these hospitals and doctors, Dr. Shealy, are taking money for COVID diagnosis and sometimes killing people by sticking vents down their lungs, what does the average person think, and how do they know who or what institution to believe for a diagnosis, a prognosis, anything, Dr. Shealy?
Well, my favorite medical directive is, if I am found unconscious, do not call an ambulance. Let me die in place. I do not wish to go to any hospital ever again under any circumstance whatsoever. If I live 10 years or 100 years, I'm not going back into a hospital. That's my personal belief.
Wow, that's a very strong comment. But, you have a lot of people who don't have medical degrees. And speaking of medical degrees, Dr. Shealy, isn't it true that most physicians don't live to the average life expectancy than the average person? And why do you think that is?
No, they actually, that's one of the ads that occurs frequently. I don't want to get into too much controversy. However, the book Dead Doctors Don't Lie was a total lie. It took me several years to prove that he was wrong in that. But the average physician actually slightly outlives the average person, because in general, it's because we have slightly better habits. Not as bad as the 97.3% of Americans, but the average physician has slightly better habits with less smoking, less obesity, etc.
Mm-hmm. I've known. Yeah, in my 20 years of being in the pharmaceutical industry, I probably agree, but I also knew a lot of exceptions to that rule where some physicians smoked, some were quite obese.
Oh, yeah. Stupid. I mean, that's the ultimate stupidity, of course.
Well, I've known a lot of physicians personally that I've done interests and hobbies and had personal friendships with, and I think one of the big things that they admit that they did wrong is self-medicate. What's your feeling on that, Dr. Shealy?
That I do not know. I am a non-drug person, and so the idea of taking even aspirin is repulsive to me. And you couldn't pay me. I mean, every time I've had a surgery, my first statement as I wake up, don't give me any of that crap. I don't want a narcotic even after surgery.
Dr. Shealy, in the beginning of the program, I talked about Big Pharma, and I made a comment about how they don't want to cure, they manage symptoms for profit, and certain institutions like the AMA, that's owned by Big Pharma. What's your comments on that?
They have been since about 110 years ago. They're part of the evil empire. But the dental profession is slightly worse, in my opinion, because of fluoride in the water and fluoride and silver mercury fillings. I consider the dental profession definitely part of the evil empire.
Wow. All right, Dr. Shealy, I have an article here titled Radiation Exposure Can Increase Risk of Hypertension Even in Low Doses. So when you look at electromagnetic radiation, could be Wi-Fi in your home, could be living in urban, suburban America and having 5G next to you, especially if you've been injected with nanotechnology and you're a walking antenna. It could be, there's radiation everywhere. What's your comment regarding radiation exposure and increased risk of hypertension, Dr. Shealy?
Well, it's not just hypertension. It's every known disease, especially cancer. I would say probably cancer is more related to it even than hypertension. But it weakens the immune system. It weakens everything.
So when we hear the AMA, the FDA, the CDC, hospitals, just Dr. Fauci, Dr. Birx, people who say we should do one thing, but they do exactly the opposite. I mean, especially regarding disease states, diagnosis, prognosis, nutrition, anything to do with the immune system, even mortality and morbidity statistics. I personally feel, and I think you and I are on the same page, maybe not the same sentence or paragraph, but the same page. How do we believe these people when they have literally sold out the people's trust to selling the narrative for their own personal gain? Dr. Shealy.
Well, I don't. I don't believe much what I hear or see. I spend hours every week on the internet trying to get back to real literature.
Wow. Back in the 70s, Dr. Shealy, basically the last decade where political correctness was not affecting our life. In other words, truth or lack of truth. I remember reading an article and they were talking about the Eskimo lifestyle. And that was before PC, because now we're supposed to address them as Inuits. But back then they were Eskimos. And they had a certain very physical lifestyle. They hunted, they fished, they trapped. They ate a lot of raw fish. And because of the raw fish and their lifestyle, I remember reading a study that they were associated with no depression and no or little heart disease. Your comments on that?
Well, I totally agree. Again, I consider Bill Gates and Fauci and George Soros to be three of certainly the most evil men in the history of the world.
Yeah, but what can the people do about this? Especially, I mean, you look at, I know it's not called Monsanto anymore for PR purposes, but 96% of the shareholders voted not disclose GMO ingredients for their own personal gain and thickness of their wallet. and this is the era we're living in today, unfortunately. We'll be right back with Dr. Norm Shealy. We really appreciate you being here, everybody. Last segment coming up. Welcome back to the broadcast, everybody. Rich Sheeben sitting in for Vincent Finelli, and I'm with Dr. Norm Shealy. And Dr. Shealy, I think a big motive of what's or symptom of what's happening today in America is that when you eliminate hard work, effort, proven results, and qualifications, you lower the bars of standards and expectations for a job based on whatever, we have these behaviors and lack of checks to power who want to destroy us for the purpose of power, money, control, depopulation, whatever their agenda is. So that being said, and by the way, we really appreciate you being here. I really enjoy interviewing you, Dr. Shealy. You truly are an American treasure. Regarding enzymes, there are catalysts for biochemical reactions which aid in digestion and nutrient support. Regarding eating raw foods versus cooked foods, mostly obviously fruits and vegetables, and the benefits of eating raw regarding vitamins and minerals and attaching that to immune stimulants versus immune suppressants, how would you address that topic, Dr. Shealy?
Well, in general, for vegetables and fruits, they're definitely better raw, almost always. But then there's certain of the root vegetables like rutabagas and carrots and that kind of thing that are better cooked. But for meat, I definitely think it is better slightly cooked.
And do you say that, like rutabagas and carrots, you say to slightly cook them for the purpose of better absorbing vitamins and minerals, or taste?
Better absorption.
I see. But the majority of vegetables, you would agree, like tomatoes, broccoli, leafy
peppers, all the leafy ones, yeah, definitely better raw.
Okay.
Even broccoli is better raw.
Okay.
Even
now,
broccoli.
when you cook, regarding enzymes, if you cook vegetables over a certain temperature, and I've read as little as 130 degrees Fahrenheit, that's when you destroy those enzymes.
Exactly.
And it affects.
Absolutely true.
Are there any other vegetables besides rutabagas and carrots that you would say that you recommend to slightly cook?
Well, I don't think we should eat Irish potatoes at all, but sweet potatoes definitely need to be cooked as well.
Mm-hmm.
Sweet potatoes are infinitely better than Irish potatoes.
Okay. Now, I hear a lot of people, we talk about this on the air. I have an acronym. I labeled it SARP, synthetic, artificial, refined, and processed. And we have so much crap in our foods, especially processed foods, and from MSG to fructose, high fructose corn syrup, tons of artificial sweeteners, propylene glycol, which is an antifreeze basically in our foods. And a lot of this is designed to be addictive. When people go shopping, Dr. Shealy, they don't have, I live off the land, I grow a garden, I raise animals, I hunt and fish. It's not that we don't shop in a store. We do. It's not that we don't go to other people's houses for dinner or to a restaurant now and then. Okay? That it happens. And so we're not 100%, clean food, if you will. But what recommendation do you have for people who want to get healthier, especially, get away from the...
Don't shop the center aisles. In the center aisles, I will buy only one thing, and that is pure fruit juices. If it has anything added to it other than vitamin C, I won't buy it. And if it comes in a plastic bag, a paper bag, or a cardboard box, it is junk. I haven't bought a home cereal in over 45 years.
Wow.
It's junk.
Yeah, but how many people, Dr. Shealy, have your discipline your intelligence, your ability to and desire to learn, to read, to research. I mean, how many people do you think...
How about common sense?
Yeah.
To me, the uncommon commodity is common. In fact, just got the final edited edition of my latest book, Restore Common Sense. It'll hopefully be out within the next 6 months.
Oh, that'd be great. Yeah, common sense is obviously not a qualification for a job in America, is it?
And it doesn't belong in a grocery store.
Yeah, we've allowed, and this is all done by design by the powers that be, because
the food industry is as bad as the tobacco industry.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Shealy, we're out of time, and I can't tell you how honored I am to interview you, and we appreciate you being here. And to the listeners around the world, we appreciate you being here. You all have a great day, and I'll be back on the air tomorrow. Take care,
Merry
everybody.
Christmas, everyone. Thanks.
Merry Christmas. Thank you, Dr. Shealy.